Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So one of the great things about vending machines, you know what you're going to get, right? You see what you want, you put in your money, you get what you get. Except when you don't, right? You put your money in, you make the selection, you hear that, and that like spinner starts to go, and then it just kind of stays right there, and you're like, come on. And it doesn't come out. I mean, that's the worst. Now you're not only hungry, but you're hangry as well, right? I mean, the vending machine broke its promise. Everyone knows vending machines are built on a simple agreement. You put something in, you get something out, right? That's just how it works. I think it's also how many of us think life works as well, right? If I work hard, I will succeed. If I'm kind, people will be kind back. If I make good decisions, good things should happen in my life. If I'm faithful to God, God will bless me. And we may not say that out loud, but that's kind of how many of us think life should be. And then something happens. You get that diagnosis. Your marriage falls apart. A child makes choices we never imagined. A job disappeared. A loved one dies. Suddenly, the machine is not working like we think it should. We put in faithfulness and prayer and obedience and trust, but what comes out at certain points in life doesn't seem to match what we've put in. Can anyone else relate? The question isn't just, why is this happening? The question is, wait, have I misunderstood about how life with God works? After 32 years of ministry, I've sat with enough people to know that eventually everyone encounters a broken vending machine moment. Right? That moment when life stops making sense, the moment when the equations no longer balance, the moment when you discover faith with God was never really a contract. Welcome to a standalone sermon today on the entire book of Job, and I'm calling it, That's Messed Up. All right? Job is one of those books of the Bible that many of us at least know a little bit about, but if we were pressed to come up with an outline of the book and some of its major themes, well, we may not take that challenge. Which is a shame, because Scottish essayist and historian Thomas Carlyle once said this about the book of Job: it's the greatest thing ever written with a pen. I mean, that's a pretty hot take, right? That might make you want to stand up and take notice. The book of Job is part of the Hebrew Scriptures, part that the Scriptures we usually refer to as the Old Testament. Pastor and author Ann Robertson says pointedly, nobody has a clue who wrote this book, and it could have been penned anywhere from the reign of Solomon through the exile. Scholars are also clear that it wasn't just one writer at one time. It looks like multiple authors, and the book kind of came about in stages. And if knowing that multiple authors contributed to his writing bothers you a bit, well, listen to the words of late 19th, early 20th century author G.K. Chesterton, who in his introduction to the book of Job said, when we enter into any grand cathedrals of the world, each one constructed over many years by many different artisans, we do not measure their beauty or their abiding witness to truth by the dates when their individual sections were completed. Good point. We look at the whole of cathedrals, so we will be looking at the whole of the book of Job. Job is basically a really long poem that's framed by a narrative folk tale. Now, it's not history. Very few scholars think this was something that actually happened. It's sort of a parable story. It's not characterized as history in either the Hebrew or the Christian scriptures. Translations of the book can vary widely. In fact, the Septuagint, which is the earliest Greek version of the Old Testament, is about 400 lines shorter than the Hebrew version. Evidently, the translators were like, yeah, we don't know what to make with these lines. We're just going to leave them out. There's so much more I could say leading into the book of Job, but I think we're just going to get started, kind of go through it and catch things as they come. Job chapter 1, verse 1. There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Biblical scholar J. Gerald Jansen, in his interpretation commentary on Job, mentions that the name Job can either be translated as where is the divine Father or persecuted one. And most scholars, they're not sure of the precise location of the town of Uz either. So more than one commentator said that these two aspects, the name and the location, it kind of makes, it's kind of like the beginning of this book is saying, once upon a time, or a long time ago in a, maybe not a galaxy, but a land far, far away, right? And Job's character is very upfront there in verse 1. He is blameless and upright, one who fears God and turns away from evil. I found it interesting that Samuel Ballantyne in his Smith and Helby's commentary on Job says this specific list of virtues isn't connected to any other person in the Hebrew Scriptures than Job. And we'll soon see he has extraordinary faith and piety. Verse 2, there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the east. Now, you've heard me say this before, but when you're reading through the Bible and you get to a number, many times the number means more than just the number there. The numbers to pay attention to here are 7, 3, and 10. 7 often indicates completeness. 3 points to divine significance. Together they make 10, which is a number of fullness or wholeness. And I know some of you are going to say, what about the 500s? Well, put the two 500s together, you get 1,000. That's another 10. Verse 4, his sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And this is what Job always did. What a blessing when your kids or your grandkids love being together, right? Job's children loved being together. They would gather on a regular basis to eat, to share meals, to celebrate with one another. And Job plays the role of family priest, right? Sanctifying them, offering sacrifices just in case any of them had sinned and they hadn't made themselves right with God. What a loving and thoughtful father. Verse 6. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser also came among them. 2 things that stand out in this verse that we need to pay a little closer attention to. The first is the heavenly beings, right? The Hebrew translation is literally sons of God. Some versions refer to it as the heavenly council. And this imagery is that of royal attendants who stand before a king in order to report on the activities for which they've been given responsibility, and also to receive instructions from the king to do whatever the king commands. It was a concept that was common in the ancient Near East. It was used in Egypt, in Babylon, in Canaan. Samuel Ballantyne says that it's never fully articulated in the Hebrew Bible, the full understanding of this, but there are numerous references and allusions to it. So this was clearly part of how the Hebrews thought. We can kind of think of it like God's heavenly staff meeting. Second, there's the accuser. Now, the Hebrew word here is ha-satan, which has caused some translations to simply refer to the accuser as Satan, Satan. But we shouldn't picture a red devil with horns and a pitchfork, or even the image of the entity that Jesus battled during the New Testament. No, the New Revised Standard Version accurately translates ha-Satan as the accuser. It's not a personal name, it's a title. The accuser's responsibility on the divine council is really that of a prosecuting attorney to bring charges against humans before the Lord. Ha-Satan is not God's adversary. His intentions are neither evil nor opposed to God's purposes. That understanding of Satan didn't come until much later in time, at that period in between the Old and the New Testaments. This adversary, Ha-Satan, simply probes human behavior according to God's directives, and it's in search of truth and faithfulness. Verse 7. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" The accuser answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Right? So at the weekly staff meeting, God asked the accuser, what you been up to? I've been doing what you told me to do, hanging out on earth, going here and there. And God says, well, when you've been on earth, have you noticed my servant Job? He's a really great guy. Verse 9, then the accuser answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? I mean, you've blessed the work of his hands. His possessions have increased in the land. But if you stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to the accuser, very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him. So the accuser went out from the presence of the Lord. Hasatan is like, yeah, I know he's teacher's pet, right? You blessed him so much. Have you counted all the sheep and camel and oxen and servants? No wonder he worships you. Hey, God, you want to place a little wager on his faithfulness? The accuser asks. And God takes the bet, with the only stipulation being that Job can't be physically harmed at all. Now, if we're going to be streaming a new Netflix series, man, this would be pretty exciting, right? How many different episodes and different challenges could come across Job's way? It would set up for an amazing series, but it's a story from the Bible, a story that's supposed to tell us something about God, humankind, the way the world works, and it makes us uneasy to hear this back and forth going on, right? And Job is about to, pardon the stealing of another book title, get news of a series of unfortunate events. Verse 13. One day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came in and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came in and said, the Chaldeans, they formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels, carried them off, killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and then suddenly this wind came across from the desert. It struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell on the young people, and they're all dead. I alone escaped to tell you. I mean, boom, 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 boom. One after another, 4 devastating calamities hit Job. And the origins of these heartbreaks alternate between earthly and heavenly sources, right? The Sabaeans, and then a fire from heaven. The Chaldeans, and then finally a great wind. And our initial response, if you're anything like me, is, man, that is messed up. Verse 20, then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground, and worshiped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. If you've ever sang that contemporary worship song, Blessed be the name of the Lord, blessed be the name of the Lord, it comes out of this. When his entire world collapses, his livestock are stolen by raiding enemies, natural disasters wreak havoc on his property, and worst of all of his children are killed. We're told that Job doesn't curse or blame God at all. Blessed be the name of the Lord, he says. Now, you may have heard that the book of Job seeks to answer the age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? It's definitely an issue that is raised all throughout the book. It's a question that you can also find in other cultures in the ancient Near East. Samuel Ballantyne lifts up textual evidence from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Syria and Palestine that discussions about innocent suffering, random disorder, divine injustice, and the futility of life were major concerns in those cultures as well. And so by the time the book of Job is penned by biblical writers, Others in the area have been exploring these same themes for more than 2,000 years. But the deeper question that comes out of this opening chapter, and it will echo in successive chapters as well, is this: why are good people good? Like, are people good because their life is going good? Because of the blessings that they have? Do people worship God only when life is going good because of what God has done for them? Or is God intrinsically worshipful on his own? Like, can human beings love God just for who God is and not for what God does for them? When we turn to chapter 2, it's time for another heavenly staff meeting. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" The accuser answered, "Lord, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down in it." The Lord said to the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Now look at that last statement by God. You incited me against him, God tells Hasatan, the accuser. I mean, that should raise a few eyebrows, right? Ballantyne notes that this phrase carries a negative connotation, as in stirring up someone into action against another that would never have occurred if not for provocation. And in fact, this is the only place in the Hebrew Bible where this phrase is used for God being the one who's coerced. Right? No matter what role the accuser plays here, God is taking responsibility for what happened to Job, which should make us uncomfortable. Verse 4, then the accuser answered the Lord, "Skin for skin, all that the man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to the accuser, "Very well, he is in your power, only spare his life." Yeah, you know why he's faithful, the accuser says. Because you didn't want his body afflicted, right? Change that variable, the whole equation changes. And surprisingly, God agrees to the accuser's plan. Wait, seriously? I mean, isn't that messed up? Verse 7, so the accuser went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself, and he sat among the ashes. Now, we don't know what kind of skin affliction Job has here, but it doesn't look like it's much fun, does it? One of our former church members here once told me she had shingles inside her ear. Not on the outside, on the inside of her ear. It lasted for 6 months. She said it was the most excruciating pain she had ever felt in her life. I went out and got the shingles vaccine when she told me about that story. I mean, poor Job, he's got sores all over his body, and the only relief he can get from the itchiness is taking a broken piece of pottery and scratching himself. Verse 9, then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive good from God and not receive evil?" And in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. Okay, I'm going to give Job a pass on the any foolish woman remark. I'm going to chalk it up to the stress of his immediate medical emergency. But here we get to meet Job's wife, who remains nameless. Now, many have come to equate Job's wife with her infamous line, "Curse God and die," which on the surface seems kind of a bit of a heartless comment. But Samuel Ballantyne mentioned that in his commentary that the original Hebrew text has the word bless, not curse. Because bless was used euphemistically for curse, kind of like how they say in the South, "Oh, bless her heart." They're not really wanting to bless her, you know? But if we read the text without assuming that you had to substitute curse for bless, the wife's comment to Job could be treated very differently, right? She might be saying something like, you have indeed maintained your integrity through all the stuff that you have suffered. Keep it up. Bless God even though you may die. By the way, she's the only woman that speaks in the entire book. So maybe we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss her. Verse 11, now when Job's 3 friends heard all of these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort Job. When they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. And they raised their voices and they wept aloud. They tore their robes. They threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. These are the friends I was talking about during children's time. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Their hearts are in the right place, right? They want to come and console and comfort Job, which is, of course, what friends do. But they're so overwhelmed by what they saw, it moves them to tears, and they just sit in silence for a week, for they saw that his suffering was very great. I remember when I was being trained to be a hospital chaplain during my 3rd year of seminary, and when I would go to visit someone in the hospital and they would share their story, I'd always try to kind of cheer them up and say something that would be positive and encouraging. And my supervisor said, Jim, you don't always have to say something. Just being there, you represent Christ. Sometimes the best thing we can do with our friends is sit with them and cry with them. So, that's the end of the opening folktale. Scholars think that was the oldest part of the book that was written. And I know, it's messed up, isn't it? Because Job knows he hasn't sinned, and we don't hear from the accuser, Hasatan, anymore in the book. The writing style now changes from prose, paragraph form, to poetry. In fact, basically the rest of the book is poetry, except for the last half of the very last chapter, chapter 42. This poetry is a series of dialogues between Job and his friends, between Job and God. And then we get this, and Job lived happily ever after ending, which is tacked on even later in the composition of the book. Now, we've seen the best of Job's friends, and from here, it's all downhill, because once they open their mouths, not so good. Most of the remaining chapters are comprised of speeches by the friends. They seem determined to try to get Job to admit to some unacknowledged sin in his life. I love Frederick Buechner. In his wonderfully written book, Peculiar Treasures of Biblical's Who's Who, he says this about Job's friends. He had 4 well-meaning but insufferable friends who came over to cheer him up and try to explain it. I mean, they said that anybody with enough sense to come in out of the rain knew that God was just. And they said that anybody old enough to spell his own name knew that since God was just, God made bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. And they said that such being the case, he didn't need a Harvard degree to figure out that since bad things happened to Job, ipso facto, he must have done something bad himself. Now remember, this is the vending machine view of God, right? When God is disappointed with sin in your life, God sends you troubles, heartaches, and misfortunes. When a religious leader announces that a natural disaster has befallen upon a particular group of people because of their sin, that is this vending machine theology. Oh, and by the way, the book of Job says it's bad theology. The flip side is just as true, right? Whenever you've had a great day, whether you're on the golf course and hit a great shot and you're like, I went to church last week, must be living right. A parking spot opens up, you're like, yeah, I'm living good. That's why God gave me this parking spot. Well, that's also perpetuating this vending machine theology. And of course, over the book, it drives Job crazy. He knows he hasn't sinned. There's nothing he hasn't confessed to God. In chapter 13, Job's had enough, and he says to his friends, as for you, you whitewash with lies. All of you are worthless physicians. If only you would keep silent, that would be your wisdom. So back and forth, Job and his friends go, none of them able to silence Job's rebuttals to their everything happens for a reason theology. Eventually, the friends give up, and a fourth friend enters the picture, Elihu. You can find him in chapters 33 to 37. Samuel Ballantyne says these speeches were present in the Job manuscripts that were discovered at the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Qumran community, which means that this part of the book also came much later than the first two parts that were written. It was at least in place by the 1st century BCE. And Ballantyne mentions that the Elihu's speeches may have been a commentary on the original book of Job. Well, that didn't answer the questions enough. Let's put another character in and say what we really think happened there. Elihu says, in effect, that all of this that happened to him, that was God's attempt to help him improve his character and sharpen his sensitivities, because, again, everything happens for a reason. You won't find that phrase in there, but you'll hear it through everything that is said. And spoiler alert, neither Job nor God is pleased with friend number 4. And then we get to chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. The whole book, Job's been like, why is this happening? Come on, God, tell me, let's go, let's argue this out. Eventually he's like, I would like to take God to court. We don't hear the prosecuting attorney there, but God never answers until chapter 38. Friedrich Buechner says, what follows is the most gorgeous speech that God makes in the whole Old Testament. It's composed of almost entirely of the most gorgeous and preposterous questions that have ever been asked by God or anyone else. Questions like, God says to Job, have you entered the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Where is the dwelling of light? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or has the rain a father? Can you bind the chain of the Pleiades, one of the constellations in the night sky? Who has put wisdom in the clouds or giving understanding to the mists? Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your crib? The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? Have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder, who says among the trumpets, ha ha, and smells the battle afar off? Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and stretch her wings towards the south? These are just a few of the many questions that God throws back at Job. And then in chapter 42, the very last chapter of the book, Job says, all right, I get it. Your resume is very different from my resume. I don't understand everything. Okay. You be God, I'll be Job. And then God finishes with this. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So this is God saying, everything happens for a reason is not my plan. God then prescribes a plethora of sacrifices for the friends, and eventually says, it's a good thing that your buddy Job has been praying for you. I'm going to hear his prayer, and I will forgive you. And then, because everybody likes a happy ending to a story, there's another folktale that's tacked on at the very end of chapter 42, where Job gets twice as much as he had before the disasters hit from God. At least twice as many sheep, camel, oxen, and donkeys. He doesn't get twice as many kids, but he gets 10 more. Again, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And it finishes with, after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations, and Job died old and full of days. The end. Now, throughout history, people have come back to the book of Job looking for the answer to basically one question: why do bad things happen to good people? And after 42 chapters, Job doesn't really get an answer to that. God never explains the wager with the accuser, the suffering he endured, the loss he experienced. Instead, the book quietly turns our attention to a different question: why are good people good? The accuser thought he knew the answer. It was Job's blessings, of course. All those amazing things in his life, he couldn't help but worship you. But if you take away his wealth, his health, his security, you take away his future, take away everything, he will curse you, God. But that's not how the story played out. Job struggled, yes. He questioned, yes. He argued, he lamented, he even demanded answers from God. But somehow, through it all, he kept turning to God. Not because his life was working out, not because he understood where things were going, not because he got what he wanted. He turned to God because he believed God was still God. And maybe that's the deepest question that this book asks of us today. If the blessings disappeared, if life stopped making sense, if the vending machine broke, would God still be enough? Because sooner or later, every one of us will face a season when faith is no longer rewarded the way we expect it to be. And in those moments, the book of Job reminds us, faith with God is not a contract. Faith with God is a relationship with one who remains worthy of our trust, even when we don't understand why all these things are happening. But I will be with you through it all, says God. And maybe that's not as messed up as it once seemed. Thanks be to God. Amen.